Kansas lawmakers looking to increase penalties for those caught stealing livestock.
Last year, dozens of cattle were stolen from ranchers across the state who say that the problem does need to be addressed. Sophia Gernander joins us from the newsroom to break down that bill.
Mike and Rachel, this bill would increase the penalty for livestock theft from a misdemeanor to a non-person level 5 felony, meaning up to 10 years in prison. 2025 saw dozens of cattle stolen from ranchers across Kansas. In September, close to 60 heads were stolen from ranchers near the town of Atlanta. One of those ranchers lost 30 cattle and says he never got them back. Lawmakers tried to pass a similar bill last year and it failed. This year, the bill specified the definition of livestock to mean cattle and horses. It also includes implements, vehicles, and trailers. The penalty for stealing livestock in Kansas is currently a misdemeanor, but in the state of Oklahoma, it's a felony and a misdemeanor to sell livestock. Ranchers say this creates a cycle where thieves will steal cattle in Kansas and then sell them in Oklahoma.
It would be nice to send a message that to those that are committing these kind of crimes.
Some of these trailer loads that have been stolen would be life sentences in the state of Oklahoma. That's why they don't have an issue in Oklahoma. In Texas, 2 to 10 years, mandatory.
The House passed the bill with only 3 no votes. It's now being debated by a Senate committee.